Inside the penthouse of the Goryeo Tower, the air was sterile, smelling of expensive ozone and chilled gin. Kwon Jin-hyuk, the chairman of the Shinhwa Syndicate, sat behind a desk of polished obsidian. He was a man of sharp angles and cold silence, his tailored charcoal suit hiding scars that told the history of Seoul's gang wars. Across from him sat the city's police commissioner, sharing a toast to a peace treaty that was nothing more than a profitable lie. Hidden inside the high-tech server closet, Lola, a 19-year-old tech prodigy and daughter of a framed detective, watched the monitors with bated breath. She had broken in to steal evidence to clear her father's name, but instead, she saw the commissioner's shadow move. On a hidden feed, she saw that peace toast was a trap. The ice in Jin-hyuk's glass was laced with a fast-acting neurotoxin, and the guards outside had already been replaced by silent assassins. With exactly 60 seconds before Jin-hyuk took the fatal sip, Lola realized that if the chairman died, the evidence she needed would be buried forever. She overrode the server room locks and sprinted into the lion's den. As the glass touched Jin-hyuk's lips, she slapped it from his hand, the crystal shattering across the obsidian desk. As the guards drew their weapons, she stared into the mafia boss's lethal eyes and whispered, "The ice is a grave. Run." The room plunged into a deafening silence before the first gunshot echoed. Jin-hyuk didn't ask questions. The moment the glass shattered, he grabbed Lola by the waist and flipped the heavy obsidian desk. A hail of bullets from the commissioner's bodyguards chewed into the stone. "Who sent you?" Jin-hyuk growled, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. He pulled a compact, blackened pistol from a hidden holster beneath the desk. "Nobody sent me. I'm the one saving your life," Lola hissed, her fingers flying across a tablet she pulled from her jacket. "The elevators are locked, and the stairwells are full of cleaners. We have to go through the waste chute." Jin-hyuk looked at the small, defiant girl. He had spent his life surrounded by vipers, but this girl had no scent of the underworld on her. She was a ghost in his machine. As a grenade rolled across the carpet, he shielded her with his carbon fiber-lined coat. "If you're lying, kid, the fall will be the least of your problems." They didn't take the chute. Lola led him to a window-washing gondola she had hacked earlier. As they lowered themselves down the side of the skyscraper, the neon lights of Seoul blurred into streaks of blue and pink. Assassins fired from the rooftop above, sparks flying as bullets hit the steel cables. "The Shinhwa Syndicate is being dismantled from the inside," Lola shouted over the wind. "Your brother, Jin-ho, sold the codes to the commissioner." Jin-hyuk's face went stone cold. The betrayal cut deeper than any blade. He realized that the empire he built on blood was being sold for a badge. He looked at the girl who was calmly rerouting the city's traffic lights on her tablet to create a getaway path. "Why help me? My men put your father in prison." "Because you're the only one who can get him out," she replied, her eyes fixed on the approaching street level. They hit the ground running, disappearing into the labyrinth of the Seoul subway system. Jin-ho's kill order hit every phone in the city. The mafia boss and the tech shadow navigated through crowded stations, using the sea of commuters as a shield. In a darkened maintenance tunnel, Jin-hyuk was forced to face his own security team, men he had raised from the gutters. He fought with a brutal, mathematical efficiency, using a tactical pen and his bare hands to neutralize them, while Lola jammed their communications. "You're a monster," she whispered, seeing the aftermath of the fight. "I'm the monster that keeps the other monsters away from you," the mafia boss replied, wiping blood from his knuckles. "Now, find me a path to the server farm. If my brother wants a digital war, he's going to get a scorched earth." The rain in Seoul didn't just fall. It drowned the city in a cold, neon-lit misery. Kwon Jin-hyuk stood at the edge of an abandoned shipyard in Incheon, his charcoal suit jacket discarded, revealing the intricate, dark ink of a tiger wrapping around his left arm, the mark of the Shinhwa Syndicate's founding bloodline. Beside him, Lola looked like a small, shivering bird, but her fingers were steady as she tapped away at a ruggedized laptop balanced on a rusted oil drum. "The server farm isn't in a building, Jin-hyuk," she said, her voice competing with the rhythmic drumming of rain on corrugated metal. It's submerged. Your brother took the cloud literally. He moved the syndicate's primary data cores into pressurized containers at the bottom of the cooling tanks in the Old Han River Power Station. It's a genius move. The water provides free cooling and a natural shield against thermal imaging. Jin Hyuk looked toward the looming silhouette of the decommissioned plant. My brother always did have a flair for the dramatic. He thinks he's built a digital fortress. He forgot that I'm the one who taught him how to hold a sword. They moved through the perimeter fence like ghosts. Jin Hyuk's movements were a masterclass in silent lethality. When a patrol of 3 men, former Shinhwa soldiers wearing the red armbands of the usurper, rounded the corner, Jin Hyuk didn't use his gun. He moved into their space before they could register the shadow. A palm strike to the chin, a sweep of the legs, and a tactical choke later. The 3 men were unconscious on the wet concrete. He didn't kill them. He was a mafia boss who valued loyalty, and these men were merely misguided pawns. He needed them alive to see who the true chairman was. Inside the station, the air was thick with the hum of high-voltage electricity and the smell of ozone. Lola guided him toward the central control room. If I can get physical access to the main terminal, I can initiate a scorched earth protocol. It won't just lock Jinho out. It will encrypt the entire syndicate's liquid assets into a cold storage drive that only my biometrics and your voice print can unlock. He'll be a king with an empty treasury. As they reached the catwalk overlooking the massive, glowing blue cooling tanks, the lights flickered and died. Emergency red strobes began to pulse, painting the room in the color of fresh blood. Jin Hyuk, a voice boomed over the intercom. It was Jinho, sounding more like a frantic child than a kingpin. You were always the favorite, the stoic warrior, the one the elders loved. But the world doesn't run on honor anymore. It runs on data, and I own the data. Suddenly, the doors at both ends of the catwalk hissed open. A dozen men in tactical gear, armed with submachine guns, stepped out. They weren't syndicate men, they were mercenaries, cleaners brought in to finish what the commissioner had started. Lola, get to the terminal, Jin Hyuk commanded, his voice dropping into that terrifying, gravelly register that had once made rival clans surrender without a fight. He pulled 2 short, weighted batons from his belt. I'll give you 3 minutes. 3 minutes? She whispered, her eyes wide. There are 12 of them. Then you'd better be fast, the mafia boss replied. What followed was a symphony of violence. Jin Hyuk didn't fight like a man. He fought like a force of nature. He used the narrowness of the catwalk to his advantage, ensuring only 2 men could reach him at a time. He moved through the gunfire, his instincts honed by 20 years of underworld warfare. He used the mercenaries' own momentum against them, sending one over the railing into the churning waters below. Bullets grazed his shoulder, tearing the expensive silk of his shirt, but he didn't slow down. He was a reaper in a designer suit. Every strike was calculated to disable or destroy. As the 10th man fell, Lola's voice screamed over the din of the alarms. Protocol initiated. Jin Hyuk, I need your voice. He stepped on the chest of the 11th mercenary, leaning toward the console Lola had cracked open. Authorization, Black Tiger. Cipher, 0709. The monitors flashed a blinding white. Across Seoul, in every Shinhwa-controlled bank and shell company, the screens went dark. The digital empire had been decapitated. Jin Hyuk stood amidst the broken bodies of the mercenaries, his chest heaving, his knuckles split and bleeding. He looked at Lola, who was staring at him with a mix of awe and terror. He reached out a bloodied hand and gently tucked a stray hair behind her ear. You did well, Shadow, he said softly. But the scorched earth has only just begun. Now, we go after the man who signed my death warrant. As they exited the power station, the flames of a small electrical fire reflected in Jin Hyuk's eyes. He wasn't just a mafia boss anymore. He was a man who had burned his own house down to ensure the rats had nowhere to hide. The Grand Hyatt Seoul sat atop Namsan Mountain like a jagged crown of glass and gold, overlooking a city that breathed in neon and exhaled smog. Tonight, it hosted the Blue Shield Gala, a charity event for the families of fallen officers, a bitter irony that wasn't lost on Lola. To the public, it was a display of civic virtue. To Kwon Jin-hyuk, it was a glass menagerie, a cage full of predators pretending to be saints. Jin-hyuk adjusted his cufflinks in the back of the black sedan. He was dressed in a midnight blue tuxedo, the fabric woven with liquid silk that shimmered like a deep bruise under the streetlights. His wound from the power station had been stitched and bandaged, hidden beneath the pristine tailoring. Beside him, Lola looked unrecognizable. Gone was the girl in the oversized hoodie and tech rig. In her place was a young woman in a gown of emerald satin, her hair pinned up with a pin that was actually a high-frequency signal jammer. "The commissioner keeps a physical ledger," Lola whispered, her voice tight with a cocktail of nerves and adrenaline. "He's old school. He doesn't trust the cloud for his most sensitive bribes. It's in a biometric safe inside his private suite on the 20th floor. If I can get in, I can scan the original documents that prove he planted the evidence against my father." Jin-hyuk handed her a small earpiece. "You have 30 minutes from the moment we enter the ballroom. My men have created a diversion at the south gate, but the commissioner's personal security, the vanguards, will be tight. They know I'm alive, Lola. They're expecting a frontal assault. They aren't expecting a ghost." The mafia boss stepped out of the car, offering his arm to her with the practiced grace of a nobleman. As they entered the ballroom, the air shifted. The chatter of Seoul's elite dipped as eyes turned toward them. Jin-hyuk was a ghost returned to haunt the living. The commissioner, standing near a fountain of flowing champagne, froze, his glass halfway to his lips. "Chairman Kwon," the commissioner said, his voice a forced joviality that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "I heard a rumor you had retired." "Rumors are the currency of the weak, Commissioner," Jin-hyuk replied, his voice a smooth, low rumble that carried across the immediate circle. "I found I missed the company of honest men. So I came here." While Jin-hyuk locked the commissioner in a verbal chess match, Lola slipped away. She moved through the crowd like a shadow, her emerald dress blending into the lush decor. She reached the service elevators, using a hacked keycard to bypass the security floor lock. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, rhythmic thud that felt loud enough to trigger the alarms herself. On the 20th floor, the hallway was a long stretch of plush carpet and silent surveillance. Lola pulled a small canister from her clutch, a specialized aerosol that revealed the infrared laser grids crisscrossing the air. She moved with the lithe precision of a dancer, contorting her body through the gaps in the light. Inside the suite, the safe sat behind a painting of a traditional Korean crane. She knelt before it, connecting her laptop to the digital interface while her hands worked the manual dial. "Come on," she hissed, "talk to me." Downstairs, the tension was reaching a breaking point. Jin-hyuk stood in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by the commissioner's vanguards. They were closing in, their hands hovering near their jackets. "You're a long way from the gutters of Incheon, Jin-hyuk," the commissioner sneered, leaning in close. "You have no power here. No servers. No soldiers. You're just a man in a suit waiting to be buried." Jin-hyuk smiled, a slow, predatory baring of teeth. "A man in a suit is never just a man, Commissioner. He is a message." At that moment, the lights in the ballroom flickered. On the massive projector screens meant to show the charity's success stories, a different image appeared. It was a live feed from the suite upstairs. The guests gasped as they saw Lola opening the safe, pulling out a thick, leather-bound ledger, and flipping to a page titled Project Blackout, Detective Kong. The ballroom erupted. The commissioner lunged for Jin-hyuk, but the mafia boss was faster. He caught the official's wrist, twisting it until the bone groaned. With his other hand, he pulled a small, concealed microphone from his lapel. "The glass menagerie is breaking," Jin-hyuk announced to the room, his voice amplified by the gala's own sound system. "And the predators are finally out of their cages." Lola burst through the service doors a moment later, the ledger clutched to her chest. She saw Jin-hyuk standing over the kneeling commissioner, the elite of Seoul watching in horrified silence as their golden idol was stripped bare. "I have it," she breathed, her eyes shining with tears. "I have everything. But the victory was short-lived. From the back of the room, the double doors swung open. Jin-ho, Jin-hyuk's brother, entered, flanked by a squad of men carrying tactical rifles. He wasn't smiling anymore. He looked like a man who had lost everything and was ready to burn the world to stay warm. "You always were too loud, brother," Jin-ho spat. "The ledger doesn't matter if there's no one left alive to read it." Jin-hyuk stepped in front of Lola, shielding her as the first shots rang out, shattering the crystal chandeliers and plunging the glass menagerie into a rain of falling diamonds and lethal intent. The sound of the first rifle volley was not a bang, but a sharp, crystalline roar as the three-tiered Swarovski chandeliers above the ballroom disintegrated. Thousands of glass shards, the diamond rain, cascaded down upon the elite of Seoul, turning the gala into a slaughterhouse of light and gravity. Screams ripped through the air, but Kwon Jin-hyuk didn't shout. He moved with a cold, mechanical focus, seizing the heavy mahogany podium and flipping it to create a barricade for Lola. "Keep your head down and hold that ledger like it's your own heart," Jin-hyuk commanded. His voice was a low anchor in the rising sea of panic. Jin-ho stood at the entrance, his face twisted in a manic grin that spoke of a mind pushed past its breaking point. He wasn't a mafia boss anymore. He was a scavenger picking through the ruins of his own family. "Kill them all," he screamed to his mercenaries. "I don't care about the ledger. Burn the room." The mercenaries didn't hesitate. Tracers cut through the dim, emergency red lighting, stitching lines of fire across the emerald satin of the walls. Jin-hyuk reached into the waistband of his tuxedo and pulled his custom Shinhwa .45, a weapon that felt like a natural extension of his arm. He leaned out from the podium, firing 2 rhythmic shots. 2 mercenaries fell, their tactical lights spinning wildly on the floor. "Jin-hyuk, the east exit is blocked by fire," Lola cried, her voice cracking as a bullet splintered the wood inches from her ear. She was curled into a ball, the leather-bound ledger tucked under her chin. "We're boxed in. If we stay here, they'll just spray the podium until there's nothing left of us." The mafia boss scanned the room. His tactical mind, sharpened by a decade of urban warfare, saw the geometry of the room as a series of kill zones and escape vectors. The commissioner was gone, likely slipped away through a private bulkhead during the initial chaos, but Jin-ho was the immediate threat. "The kitchen service lift is behind the fountain," Jin-hyuk muttered, more to himself than to her. "But there's 40 feet of open marble between us and that door. They have the high ground on the mezzanine." He looked at Lola. For the first time, he saw the raw terror in her eyes, the realization that her quest for justice had led her into a literal war zone. A strange, unfamiliar emotion flared in Jin-hyuk's chest, not the cold duty of a protector, but the fierce, burning rage of a father. He realized then that he couldn't just win this fight. He had to end it. "Lola, listen to me," he said, grabbing her shoulders. "When I move, you run. Don't look at me. Don't look at them. You run for that fountain. The water is deep enough to provide cover from small arms fire. Once you hit the water, crawl to the service door." "What about you?" she gasped. "I'm going to give them something else to look at." Jin-hyuk didn't wait for her to argue. He stood up, fully exposing himself to the mezzanine. He didn't fire at the mercenaries. He fired at the gas lines feeding the decorative flambe stations along the wall. The resulting explosion was a localized sun, a wall of orange fire that sent a shockwave through the ballroom, knocking the mercenaries off balance and filling the air with thick, black smoke. "Go," he roared. Lola bolted. She ran with a speed born of pure desperation, her emerald dress trailing behind her like a streak of forest fire. Jin-hyuk followed a second later, but he didn't run for the fountain. He ran toward the stairs leading to the mezzanine. He was a shadow moving through the smoke, his movements invisible to the disoriented gunman. He reached the top of the stairs just as Jin-ho was reloading his weapon. The brothers stared at each other for a fractional second, one representing the old world of honor and blood, the other representing the new world of greed and betrayal. "You always thought you were better than me," Jin-ho hissed, leveling his gun. "But look at you, Jin-hyuk, dying for a detective's daughter. How far the tiger has fallen. The tiger hasn't fallen, Jin Hyuk replied, his voice a ghost's whisper. He just stopped playing with his food. Jin Hyuk lunged. He didn't use his gun. He used his body as a weapon, tackling his brother through the glass railing. They tumbled through the air, a blur of blue silk and charcoal wool, falling 20 feet back down toward the ballroom floor. They slammed into the central fountain, the water erupting in a massive plume that doused the nearby fires. Underwater, the world was a silent, blue-tinted void. Jin Hyuk felt the impact jar his bones, but he didn't let go of Jin Ho's throat. He held his brother under, watching the bubbles rise as Jin Ho struggled. It would have been so easy to end it there, to let the water wash away the betrayal. But a hand reached into the water. Lola. She grabbed Jin Hyuk's arm, pulling him back toward the surface. We have to go? The vanguards are regrouping. Jin Hyuk released his brother, leaving the gasping, broken man in the shallow pool. He surged out of the water, his tuxedo ruined, his hair plastered to his forehead. He grabbed Lola, and together they disappeared through the service door just as the first tactical teams breached the main entrance. Behind them, the Grand Hyatt was a tomb of glass and fire. In front of them lay the rain-slicked streets of Seoul and a ledger that held the power to topple a government. The diamond rain was over, but the storm was only beginning. The rain had turned from a drizzle into a torrential downpour, a gray curtain that draped over the port of Incheon. The city behind them was a glowing hive of sirens. The diamond rain at the Hyatt had triggered a level 4 emergency. The commissioner, desperate to bury his crimes along with the bodies in the ballroom, had declared Jin Hyuk a domestic terrorist. Every digital screen in Seoul now bore the mafia boss's face, framed by a red, wanted border. Jin Hyuk steered a stolen, rusted freighter truck through the maze of shipping containers at the Silent Harbor, a secondary shipping terminal he had kept off the books for years. The heater was broken, and the air in the cab was thick with the smell of wet wool and copper. Lola sat in the passenger seat, shivering violently despite the oversized leather jacket Jin Hyuk had draped over her. She clutched the leather ledger to her chest, as if it were a holy relic. The judge, Lola whispered, her teeth chattering. Judge Park. My father always said he was the only one who couldn't be bought. He lives in a gated estate near the coastal cliffs. If we can get this to him, he can bypass the commissioner's office and go straight to the Blue House. Jin Hyuk kept his eyes on the side mirrors. Far in the distance, the blue and red strobe lights of police cruisers flickered against the low-hanging clouds. Judge Park is a good man, Lola. But good men are fragile. By now, the commissioner has realized the ledger is missing. He won't just be looking for us. He'll be scrubbing every potential ally we have. If we show up at Park's front door, we're handing him a death sentence. He turned the truck into a narrow alley between two towering stacks of containers. This was the Silent Harbor, a place where the Shinhwa Syndicate once moved untraceable cargo. It was a labyrinth of rusted steel and salt-crusted machinery. We aren't going to his house, Jin Hyuk continued, pulling a heavy, waterproof radio from the glove box. We're going to bring him here. My brother's mercenaries and the commissioner's tactical teams are using the city's CCTV to track our movement. But the Silent Harbor has no cameras. It's a blind spot in the heart of the beast. Lola looked out at the dark, looming shapes of the containers. It looks like a graveyard. It is, Jin Hyuk replied grimly. For anyone who tries to enter without an invitation. He stepped out into the rain, his ruined tuxedo shirt clinging to his frame, the bandage on his shoulder now soaked through with a mixture of rainwater and fresh blood. He moved to the back of the truck and pulled out a heavy equipment case. Inside were 3 tactical drones and a series of motion sensor claymores. I thought you said you were a mafia boss, not a soldier, Lola said, climbing out of the cab. In Seoul, there is no difference, Jin Hyuk replied. He handed her a secure satellite phone. Call Park. Tell him to come to Pier 14. Tell him to bring a stenographer and his official seal. If we're going to do this, we do it with the full weight of the law. As Lola made the call, Jin Hyuk began setting his traps. He moved with a practiced, lethargic grace, placing sensors at the 3 main entry points of the container yard. He knew the peace wouldn't last. The commissioner wasn't just a politician. He was a desperate man with the entire resources of the Seoul Metropolitan Police Agency at his disposal. 20 minutes later, a single, black sedan with government plates pulled into the yard. Judge Park stepped out, looking small and frail against the industrial backdrop. He was followed by a young woman clutching a laptop, the stenographer. "Chairman Kwon," Park said, his voice trembling but steady. "I heard the news. They say you've lost your mind. They say you're holding a detective's daughter hostage." Jin Hyuk stepped into the light of the car's headlamps, gesturing toward Lola. "Does she look like a hostage to you, Judge? Or does she look like the daughter of a man you allowed to be buried in a cage of lies?" Lola stepped forward, handing the ledger to the judge. The rain battered the leather cover as Park opened it. He used a flashlight to scan the pages, names, dates, bank account numbers, and the chilling blueprints for the evidence planted against Lola's father. "My God," Park breathed, his face paling. "This isn't just bribery. This is treason." "Now you see why the diamond rain had to fall," Jin Hyuk said. "Now, Judge, I need you to sign the emergency warrant. Give me the legal authority to seize the commissioner's assets. Give the Shinhwa syndicate a reason to turn on my brother." But as Park reached for his seal, the silence of the harbor was shattered. A high-pitched whine filled the air, the sound of a drone. Suddenly, a red laser appeared on the judge's chest. "Down!" Jin Hyuk roared. He tackled the judge to the ground just as a high-caliber sniper round shattered the sedan's windshield. From the tops of the containers, tactical teams began to fast rope down, their silhouettes illuminated by the sudden flare of magnesium spotlights. The commissioner hadn't waited for them to move. He had tracked the judge's car. "Lola, get the judge behind the heavy steel," Jin Hyuk shouted, drawing his .45 and firing toward the container heights. "They don't want the ledger anymore. They want the witnesses." The silent harbor erupted into a theater of fire. Jin Hyuk moved through the darkness, using his knowledge of the yard to flank the tactical teams. He wasn't just fighting for his empire anymore. He was fighting for the truth. He drew the fire away from Lola and the judge, leading the mercenaries into the maze of claymores he had set. Explosions rocked the harbor, sending shipping containers groaning on their foundations. Amidst the smoke and the screams, Jin Hyuk was a shadow of retribution. He neutralized 3 gunmen in a flurry of close-quarters combat, his movements a blur of obsidian and steel. He reached the judge and Lola just as a helicopter rose over the pier, its searchlight blinding them. "The warrant," Jin Hyuk yelled over the roar of the rotors. "Is it signed?" Park held up the document, the ink smeared, but the seal unmistakable. "It's done, Jin Hyuk. But we'll never get out of here alive." Jin Hyuk looked at the helicopter, then at the dark, churning waters of the Incheon Bay. He grabbed a heavy flare gun from a nearby emergency locker. "The law doesn't need to get out alive, Judge. It just needs to be heard." He fired the flare, not at the helicopter, but at a stack of containers marked with hazardous materials, ethanol. The resulting fireball climbed hundreds of feet into the air, a signal that could be seen from the Blue House itself. Under the cover of the inferno, Jin Hyuk led them toward a waiting high-speed RIB boat hidden beneath the pier. As the engine roared to life, he looked back at the burning harbor. The tiger was no longer hiding. He had burned the silent harbor to the ground, and in its ashes, the truth was finally beginning to glow. The Blue House, the executive heart of South Korea, sat nestled against the dark, jagged peaks of Mount Bugak. In the pre-dawn mist, its traditional blue-tiled roof looked like a sleeping dragon. But the peace was a lie. The city of Seoul was under a state of garrison decree, a shadow martial law enacted by the commissioner under the guise of capturing the terrorist Kwon Jin Hyuk. The streets leading to the palace were choked with armored vehicles and checkpoints. Inside a nondescript delivery van smelling of stale bread, Jin Hyuk sat in the back, his face illuminated only by the rhythmic flash of police sirens passing outside. He was stitching the gash on his own forearm with a curved needle and fishing line, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his neck stood out like cords. He didn't use an anesthetic. He needed the pain to stay sharp. Beside him, Lola was hunched over her laptop, her face pale. Judge Park sat across from them, clutching the signed warrant and the ledger as if they were the only things keeping him anchored to the earth. "The perimeter is airtight," Lola whispered, her fingers dancing across the keys. "The commissioner has deployed the Gwangmu unit, the elite counterinsurgency squad. They've established a 3-ring kill zone around the Blue House. No one enters, no one leaves. They aren't just protecting the president. They're isolating him so he can't receive the truth." Jin Hyuk snipped the thread with his teeth. "The president is a man of protocols. He won't act on a rumor, but he cannot ignore a verified breach of the national security protocol. Lola, can you get us into the underground utility tunnels? The ones built during the Cold War. I can open the digital locks, but those tunnels haven't been opened in 30 years, she said, looking up with wide eyes. They're filled with old sensors and physical traps. If we trigger one, the Gwangmu will be on us in seconds. We aren't going to avoid the sensors, Jin Hyuk said, his eyes darkening to the color of flint. We're going to overload them. We're going to give the Gwangmu 1,000 ghosts to haunt. They exited the van in a flooded drainage canal 2 miles from the palace. The water was waist-deep and freezing, smelling of silt and iron. Jin Hyuk led the way, his .45 held high above the waterline. Judge Park stumbled, the weight of the moment nearly crushing his resolve, but Lola caught his arm. "Stay with us, Judge," she urged. "For my father. For the law." They reached the heavy iron bulkhead of the utility tunnels. Lola connected her rig to the rusted interface. "I'm sending a pulse echo through the entire security grid. It will mirror our heat signatures 100 times over. To the Gwangmu Command Center, it will look like an entire army is emerging from every manhole in the city." "Do it," Jin Hyuk commanded. As Lola hit the key, the city above erupted into chaos. Alarms blared across the Jongno district. Tactical teams scrambled, chasing ghosts on their thermal displays. Under the cover of the digital noise, Jin Hyuk forced the bulkhead open. The air inside the tunnel was stagnant, tasting of ancient dust. They moved through the dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of Lola's tablet. Jin Hyuk was a predator in his element, his senses tuned to the subtle shifts in the air. He detected the tripwires before they could be crossed, his hands steady as he disarmed the primitive but lethal pressure plates left over from the 70s. "We're directly beneath the West Wing," Lola whispered. "There's a service elevator that leads to the kitchen pantry. From there, it's a straight shot to the president's private study." Suddenly, the tunnel echoed with a metallic clack. A spotlight cut through the dark, pinning them against the damp concrete wall. "Chairman Kwon," a voice boomed. It wasn't the commissioner. It was Tai's former head of security, who had been hired by Jin Ho as a mercenary. He stood at the end of the tunnel with 6 Gwangmu defectors, their rifles leveled. "I told your brother you'd choose the tunnels. You always did prefer the dark." Jin Hyuk said, his voice a low growl. "You sold your soul for a smaller paycheck than I ever gave you." "I sold it for a seat at the table," and replied. "And your head is the ticket." Jin Hyuk didn't hesitate. He didn't reach for his gun. He reached for a flashbang grenade pinned to his belt. "Close your eyes," he roared. The explosion in the confined space was deafening, the white light searing into the darkness. Jin Hyuk moved before the echoes died. He was a blur of violence, closing the 20-foot gap in seconds. He disarmed the first soldier with a wrist lock that shattered the man's radius, using the body as a human shield as the other mercenaries fired blindly into the smoke. He moved through the tactical fire with a terrifying, rhythmic grace. A knife appeared in his hand, and he worked with surgical efficiency, neutralizing the Gwangmu defectors in the close quarters where their long rifles were a liability. He reached in, who pulled a combat knife of his own. The two men danced a lethal duet in the shadows of the Blue House. He was younger, faster, but Jin Hyuk fought with the desperation of a man who had already died once. He caught N's blade in his palm, a sacrifice of flesh for a killing blow, and drove his own shoulder into N's chest, pinning him against the wall. "The table is full," Jin Hyuk hissed, before delivering a final, incapacitating strike. He slumped against the wall, his hand dripping blood onto the floor. Lola and Judge Park emerged from the shadows, horror and awe written on their faces. Jin-hyuk, your hand, Lola started. It doesn't matter, he snapped, his breath coming in ragged hitches. We're here. Get the judge to that elevator. They surged into the service lift, ascending into the heart of power. When the doors opened, they were in a quiet, wood-paneled pantry. Jin-hyuk led them into the hall, his presence a jarring contrast to the serene, blue-carpeted corridors of the palace. They reached the heavy oak doors of the president's study. 2 Secret Service agents drew their weapons, but Judge Park stepped forward, raising the ledger and his official seal. I am Judge Park of the High Court. I have evidence of a coup and a high-level conspiracy against the state. Stand aside or be charged with treason. The agents hesitated, seeing the blood-soaked mafia boss and the frantic girl, but it was the judge's authority that broke the line. They opened the doors. Inside, the president of South Korea sat behind a desk of carved rosewood, looking up in shock. Jin-hyuk stepped into the room, his midnight blue tuxedo shredded, his skin painted with the grime of the tunnels and the blood of his enemies. He looked like a nightmare that had wandered into a dream. He didn't speak. He stepped back, allowing Lola to walk forward. She placed the ledger on the president's desk, her hands trembling as she opened it to the page with her father's name. Mr. President, she said, her voice finally breaking. My name is Lola. My father is Detective Kong, and I'm here to tell you how your government was stolen. Jin-hyuk stood by the door, his hands still bleeding, watching as the shadow finally took the light. The Blue House gambit was complete. The tiger had delivered the truth to the dragon's lair. The dawn that rose over Seoul was not the triumphant sun of a new era, but a bruised, purple light filtering through a sky choked with smoke. While the president's office was currently a hive of frantic activity, with the Blue House gambit having successfully triggered a nationwide freeze on the commissioner's authority, the physical war was far from over. The Goryeo Tower, the skyscraper headquarters of the Shinhwa Syndicate, had become a sovereign fortress of desperation. Jinho, realizing the legal walls were closing in, had retreated to the top floor, taking the remaining loyalist soldiers and the syndicate's physical gold reserves with him. Jin-hyuk sat in the back of a black tactical van provided by a splinter group of the National Intelligence Service that had remained loyal to the president. He was being tended to by a medic, but he pushed the man's hands away as he tightened a fresh tactical vest over his ruined tuxedo shirt. His eyes were fixed on the Goryeo Tower, visible in the distance. The president has issued the warrants, Judge Park said, speaking through a secure line on Lola's laptop. The commissioner is in custody. But your brother, he's turned the tower into a kill zone. He's wired the structural supports with demolition charges. He says if the police breach the lobby, he'll drop the building into the middle of the Gangnam district. Jin-hyuk looked at Lola. She was pale, her eyes rimmed with red from exhaustion, but she hadn't left his side. He won't blow the building while he's still in it, Jin-hyuk said, his voice a cold, tactical rasp. He's waiting for a helicopter. He's going to take the gold and the digital keys to the offshore accounts and vanish. The explosives are just to buy him time. Then we can't wait for the SWAT teams, Lola said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. I've mapped the tower's internal network. Since I have the scorched earth codes from the power station, I can override the elevators. But Jinho has disconnected the penthouse from the main grid. To get to him, you have to go through the 80th floor sky bridge, the Tiger's Path. The Tiger's Path, Jin-hyuk muttered. It was a glass walkway, suspended 900 feet in the air, connecting the 2 spires of the tower. It was beautiful, iconic, and a perfect sniper's alley. I'm going in alone, Jin-hyuk commanded. Lola, stay with the NIS team. If the building starts to go, you take the ledger, and you run. Do you hear me? Lola looked at him, her lips trembling. You're not a monster, Jin-hyuk. Don't die like one. The mafia boss didn't answer. He exited the van and disappeared into the morning fog. The infiltration was a blur of violence and shadow. Jin-hyuk used the service entrance, moving through the sub-basement. He didn't use the stairs, He used the window-washing rig on the exterior, ascending the glass skin of the building as the wind whipped around him. At the 80th floor, he smashed through the glass, rolling onto the carpeted floor of the skybridge. The lights were out, the city's morning sun casting long, jagged shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows. At the far end of the bridge stood Jin-ho. He was disheveled, his eyes bloodshot, a heavy suitcase of gold bars at his feet, and a remote detonator in his hand. "You just couldn't stay dead, could you?" Jin-ho screamed, his voice echoing in the hollow space. "You always had to be the hero, the honorable chairman. Well, look at your honor now. It's written in blood on the streets." "Drop the detonator, Jin-ho," Jin-hyuk said, stepping onto the glass walkway. Beneath his feet, the morning traffic of Seoul looked like tiny, unconcerned ants. "The Goryeo is falling. The syndicate is gone. There is nothing left to rule. I have the gold. I have the keys." Jin-ho lunged forward, pulling a gold-plated Desert Eagle from his waistband. He fired, the massive rounds shattering the glass partitions around Jin-hyuk. Jin-hyuk didn't take cover. He walked forward, his own .45 held at his side. He wasn't a man afraid of death. He was a man who had already accepted it. He fired back, a single, precise shot that took the gun out of Jin-ho's hand, the gold weapon spinning across the glass. Jin-ho roared in pain, clutching his shattered fingers, but he lunged for the detonator on the floor. Jin-hyuk was faster. He tackled his brother, the two of them slamming into the glass railing. The structure groaned, the bolts straining under the impact. "If I go, we both go," Jin-ho hissed, his hand reaching for a hidden blade. They fought with the primal ferocity of two predators in a cage. No more strategy, no more tech, just the raw, ugly sound of bone hitting bone. Jin-hyuk took a blade to the ribs, a hot, searing pain that threatened to black out his vision, but he didn't stop. He caught Jin-ho's arm and snapped it over the railing, the detonator falling from his brother's grip and skittering toward the edge. Jin-hyuk pinned his brother against the glass, his forearm pressed against Jin-ho's throat. "You weren't strong enough to lead, Jin-ho. You were only greedy enough to steal." Below them, the sirens of the entire Seoul police force began to wail. The Goryeo Tower was surrounded. The fall of the Goryeo was no longer a metaphor. It was a reality. "Do it," Jin-ho choked out, his eyes wide with fear and spite. "Kill me. Be the monster everyone says you are." Jin-hyuk looked at his brother, the boy he had once protected from their father's wrath, the man who had tried to bury him. He slowly released his grip. "No," Jin-hyuk said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Death is too clean for you. You're going to sit in a cell and watch as I turn the Shinhwa Syndicate into a foundation for the people you stepped on. You're going to watch Lola's father walk free while you rot." He picked up the detonator and crushed it under his boot. He stood up, clutching his bleeding side, as the first NIS tactical teams breached the skybridge. As they dragged Jin-ho away in shadows and chains, Jin-hyuk stood alone on the tiger's path. He looked out over the city he had ruled through fear, then saved through fire. He saw the black van in the distance and knew that Lola was watching. The Mafia boss was tired, his body broken, but for the first time in his life, the obsidian in his soul felt clear. The aftermath of the fall was not a sudden silence, but a slow, rhythmic subsiding of chaos. As the sun fully crested over the Han River, the Goryeo Tower stood scarred but upright, a monument to a night that had decapitated the city's underworld. The garrison decree was lifted by presidential order, and the sirens that had screamed through the night were replaced by the somber, steady hum of a city in recovery. Kwon Jin-hyuk sat on the bumper of an ambulance at the base of the tower. A thermal blanket was draped over his shoulders, contrasting sharply with the torn, blood-stained fabric of his midnight tuxedo. He refused to be taken to the hospital yet. He sat with a cigarette held between trembling, bruised fingers, watching as federal agents hauled crates of evidence and terrified syndicate executives out of the lobby. Lola appeared through the crowd of reporters and tactical units. She was still wearing the emerald satin dress, now tattered at the hem and stained with the grime of the utility tunnels. Behind her walked a man who looked like a ghost returned to life, Detective Kong. He was thin, his prison uniform hanging loosely on his frame, but his eyes were clear. The reunion between father and daughter had happened minutes ago, a silent, weeping embrace that Jin Hyuk had watched from a distance. Now, Lola approached the mafia boss. The president's office just released a statement, she said, her voice small but firm. The commissioner has confessed. My father's record is being expunged. He's being reinstated with a full commendation. Jin Hyuk exhaled a cloud of smoke, his obsidian eyes tracking the movement of a nearby news drone. And what about me, Shadow? Did the statement mention the terrorist chairman? Lola looked at the ground, then back at him. Judge Park is negotiating. Because of the Blue House gambit and the evidence you provided, they are offering a national interest plea. You'll lose the syndicate. The Xinhua assets will be seized and liquidated into a public trust. You'll have to serve time for the prior racketeering charges, but the terrorism and murder charges from tonight? They're being ruled as self-defense in service of the state. Jin Hyuk let out a dry, rasping laugh that turned into a cough. A mafia boss as a public servant. My father would be spinning in his grave. You saved the city, Jin Hyuk, she said, stepping closer. You could have taken the gold and the keys. You could have boarded that helicopter. Why didn't you? The mafia boss stood up, his joints popping, the pain in his ribs a sharp reminder of his mortality. He looked at the Goryeo Tower, then at the ledger Lola still held. Because I was tired of being the king of a graveyard, Lola. A man can only live in the dark for so long before he forgets what the sun looks like. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, blackened key. The physical key to a private vault in Switzerland that contained his personal, untraceable fortune. It was enough money to buy a small country, or to ensure a girl and her father never wanted for anything again. He pressed it into Lola's hand. This isn't syndicate money, he whispered. This is mine. Use it to get your father a house away from this city. Go to the sea. Somewhere. The air doesn't smell like ozone and lies. I can't take this, she protested, but he closed her fingers over it, just as he had once shielded her from the bullets. Take it. It's the only clean thing I have left to give. A pair of NIS agents approached, their faces respectful but firm. They carried a pair of silver handcuffs. The time for the tiger to answer for his past had arrived. Jin Hyuk didn't resist. He offered his wrists, the cold steel clicking shut over the same skin that bore the syndicate's tiger tattoo. As they led him toward the black sedan that would take him to a high-security facility, he stopped and looked back at Lola one last time. Lola, he called out. She stopped, her father's hand on her shoulder. Don't let them turn you into a ghost. The world needs people who can see through the glass. She nodded, a single tear finally escaping. I'll be waiting, Jin Hyuk. When you get out, the morning calm will still be here. The car door closed, and the mafia boss was driven away. The Xinhua syndicate was dead. The Goryeo had fallen. But as the city of Seoul woke up to a day without the shadow of the chairman, a young woman stood on the sidewalk, holding the key to a new life and the memory of the monster who had become a guardian. The tiger was in a cage, but for the first time in 20 years, he was finally free.